Okay, welcome. I think we'll get this show on the road. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. Welcome to this Cold War International History Project book launch for Marigold, The Lost Chance for Peace in Vietnam, which will be the subject of this afternoon's discussion, a discussion that I hope you will enter in later on after we have our distinguished panelists give some initial presentations. It's just a momentous and wonderful occasion to be able to congratulate Jim on the publication of Marigold, long awaited by all of us and in production for so many years. And the Cold War Project has lived and was inspired and has suffered through the various efforts involved, but it is a true scholarly accomplishment that will, I think, be a classic and the standard work on the diplomacy of the Vietnam War, and especially the peace initiatives during the Vietnam War. Jim has pursued his research, a legacy perhaps of the Cold War Project, seeking out every last archival document and oral history source that there is to be had on this globe. And what we have here now is just an amazing accomplishment that I recommend to all of you. It's for purchase outside. Jim, of course, needs no introduction to this group. He is Associate Professor of History, International Affairs at George Washington University. Of course, my predecessor here as director of the Cold War International History Project, where he launched the project and edited the bulletin for so many years, and is still connected with us as editor of the Cold War Project's book series. Let me, while I mention this series, recognize Joe Brinley, the director of the Wilson Center Press, who played no minor role in the production. The fact that this volume has now seen the light of day. Jim is the recipient of the Stuart Burnout Prize from the Society of Historians of American Foreign Policy for his first book, another formidable volume, a biography of James B. Conant, Harvard to Hiroshima, The Making of the Nuclear Age. Has published numerous articles, too many to list here now, on various aspects of Cold War history, remains a driving force behind the Cold War Project's worldwide activities and many other Cold War-related enterprises, and of course has a number of articles to his credit in the media as well. He holds a PhD from Tufts, and a master's from Columbia, and as I mentioned, teaches now at George Washington University. He'll start us off with some glimpses into Marigold. Then we have the honor and pleasure to welcome back to the Wilson Center one of this country's leading international historians, Frederick Logevall, the John S. Knight Professor of International Studies at Cornell University. He has a distinguished teaching career to his credit, teaching at UC Santa Barbara, where he co-founded the Center for Cold War Studies, a close partner of the Wilson Center's Cold War International History Project. He is the author of the award-winning and acclaimed Choosing War, The Lost Chance for Peace and the Escalation of the War in Vietnam, a major study of the Franco-Vietnamese conflict and the road to the American war into China, forthcoming later this year, as Twilight War, The Fall of an Empire and the Making of America's Vietnam. The galleys are with us, and we're hoping to launch the event here later this year. Have him back for that. He's a specialist on U.S. foreign relations, teaches a number of courses ranging from the history of U.S. diplomacy to the international history of Cold War and Vietnam wars. He was the Leverhulme Professor of History at the University of Nottingham and a Mellon Senior Research Fellow at the University of Cambridge. He has also, like Jim, a host of books and publications, other publications to his credits on the origins of the Vietnam, terrorism, 9/11, the Encyclopedia of American Foreign Policy, Studies into Principal Movements and Ideas, the First Vietnam War, Colonial and Cold War Crisis, as well as A People and a Nation, A History of the United States, and others. Let me just conclude by saying that he has a PhD from Yale, and it's always great to have him back here at the center. And then, as our second commentator, I'm delighted and also honored to introduce Stuart Loory, who has co-authored with David Kraslow The Secret Search for the Peace in Vietnam, which he wrote while he was a White House correspondent for the LA Times, and which received the George Polk Award for Journalism in the Public Interest. He's a professor emeritus at the Missouri School of Journalism, has recently served as distinguished Fulbright professor at the Centers for East Europe and American Studies at the University of Warsaw in Poland. Prior to this, he served as the Lee Hills Chair in Free Press Studies at the Missouri School of Journalism. He is the editor of the Global Journalist, the magazine for international news, for the international news business, and the moderator of the Global Journalist weekly radio show for KBIM-FM. He has held a number of visiting professorships, too many to list all of them here, has served in a variety of other academic function. Let me just say he was the Moscow correspondent for several years and held the position of Moscow bureau chief for the New York Herald, then became a White House correspondent, as mentioned, for the LA Times during both the Johnson and Nixon administration, and very much look forward to his contemporary view of the events under discussion here today. He also authored Defeated: Inside America's Military Machine, published in 1973, then moved on later on to television, worked for TBS and CNN as a correspondent, executive producer, and vice president. So he is exquisitely prepared and qualified to comment on the history on the discussion today. So with that, we have a full program ahead of us, and I do want to find time at the end of this to invite all of you for comments and questions. Let's get started. Jim, congratulations. What an accomplishment, and over to you.
Thank you, Christian. Unlike my book, I will try to be brief. But first, let me express my appreciation to all of you for coming, and especially to the Wilson Center for all its support over the years. I'll sound like Ted Baxter recalling his old glory days. This all began actually at the Woodrow Wilson Center in the early 1990s, when the Wilson Center was not in the Ronald Reagan building but was in the Smithsonian Castle on the Mall, when an unsolicited fax came over the transom, as Rob Litwack always likes to say. And it was from the son of a recently deceased Polish diplomat. And the son, who was then a nuclear physicist at the OECD in Paris, explained that going through his late father's papers, he had found something maybe the Cold War International History Project would be interested in. And he summarized it in a few pages. It was a manuscript on Polish peace diplomacy during the Vietnam War. And it related to a couple of affairs, but one of them was the Marigold episode. And reading over this summary of a Polish communist perspective on this event, I very quickly realized that this looked very different from the other side. And I immediately got in touch with this son and got him to send me the entire 127-page, single-spaced Polish language version of the report. A colleague of ours, Leo Gluchowski, kindly translated it. It turned out to quote from hundreds of still classified Polish diplomatic telegrams and other documents. And it was, in essence, the unpublished Polish diplomatic Pentagon papers. It was an internal in-house inquiry that had been prepared when they thought there might be a need to release a white paper in a series of controversies over the Vietnam War that took place in the early 1970s, and then it was decided to just let it lay low. That set me off on, I don't know, not exactly a wild goose chase, but a very convoluted goose chase, and very exasperating and exhausting, but also extremely exhilarating and thrilling. Really, in many ways, the most exciting experiences of my life as a historian, such as it is. And in the next few minutes, what I want to try to do is give you a taste of why I found this story both so fascinating and exciting, but also so important and potentially even tragic in terms of what we understand of the history of the Vietnam War, and also significant for understanding broader aspects. This book is almost 1,000 pages, and as Christian mentioned, my earlier book was of the same scale. Unlike some of my more prolific colleagues, including on this dais, I seem to have the unfortunate habit of producing a 1,000-page book every 18 years. And I've promised my parents that the next book will be about a third as long and be produced about 3 times sooner. So with any luck, that might change. But when I get really interested in a topic, I really get interested in a topic. And among the reasons this book got so large were a couple that I'll mention before getting to Marigold, whatever Marigold is for those of you who are not Vietnam War specialists. Being here in Washington, you've all heard the cliche that, watching legislation get made is like watching sausage get made. It's a little unsavory and a little messy, and you don't want to look too closely. Well, this book has a lot of sausage making, both the sausage of diplomacy and also the sausage of history. Diplomacy in the sense that this is a very detailed exegesis of an extremely complicated diplomatic effort that involved multiple countries, and I have gotten the sources from all of the countries involved. In fact, in all, there are documents from more than 20 countries in more than 10 languages. And that involves tactical decisions, and in some cases, the book shows errors by multiple countries. At some points, one has to get to the level of explaining which time zone cables are being sent in, because they sometimes cross in the either, leading to sometimes disastrous conclusions. So there's a lot of that. But there's also the sausage of diplomatic history in taking apart the evidence that sometimes contradicts each other, but also how a highly classified episode becomes history, in this case disputed and very murky history. We're very fortunate to have on the table here, or at the table here, the co-author of the only other English language book on Marigold. It appeared in 1968, just a year after some of the events in question, and it was based on press leaks. Not a single classified document was then available. And another reason this book got so long is because it tells the war of leaks, because this was all a secret diplomatic episode, but once it collapsed, it became a ferocious and acrimonious international dispute for more than a month or so, all behind closed doors of various chancelleries around the world. But then it began to seep into public consciousness. First in a Washington Post story on the front page with blaring headlines with a quote featured saying the Americans bungled it and blaming Lyndon Johnson. And then there was an extensive counter campaign by the Johnson administration to leak their version of events, and that ended up producing a very prominently featured front page story in the New York Times, which basically was Dean Rusk's version of events, and basically said, this was nothing. This was a communist scam. There's no evidence this was really an opportunity to end the Vietnam War. And that, in turn, triggered the attentions of a couple of people at the Los Angeles Times and led to an investigation by Stuart Loory and his co-author, David Kraslow, that turned into what was, until this week, the only English language book on Marigold that ever existed. But this comes to a very different conclusion from what Lyndon Johnson came to in his own memoirs a few years later, saying there was nothing there. North Vietnam was not ready to talk. And Dean Rusk said it was all a Polish sham. William Bundy, Walt Rostow all said it was nothing except communist disinformation. And yet the analysts at the Pentagon Papers said, well, we only have the American side, but maybe this really was real. Maybe this really was serious. So it has gone into history as an unresolved dispute. It might have been a chance to end the Vietnam War years earlier, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives earlier, and in the case of America, at a far lower death toll than was actually the case. You all know, of course, that 58,000 plus Americans perished in fighting the Vietnam War. The Marigold Affair, which was, of course, a secret peace initiative in 1966, climaxed at a moment in December 1966 when a little over 6,000 Americans had been killed. So it could have been either the mischance to limit or terminate earlier this disastrous conflict whose toll dwarfs the cost to America of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars put together, or it could have been, in the words of Lyndon Johnson, much ado about nothing. And this book tackles something that has really been a daunting historical mystery for many years. Another reason this book gets so large is that it is not just, despite what I've said, a book about the Vietnam War. It takes place at a moment when the Cold War is extremely complex, and it made even more murky by the emergence of the Sino-Soviet split and all sorts of tensions within the communist world that are very poorly understood by the West, as well as subterranean tensions between the United States and many of its allies. And this book, again, uses the documents of many different actors to delve into some of these mysteries. And as mentioned, Poland is a key actor, so this is also a book about communist foreign policy in the Warsaw Pact, relations between the Soviet Union and its allies, the efforts of Soviet allies, even communist ones, to pursue their own agendas, even while also following the parameters set by the Kremlin, and even tensions within some of those countries. It also gets at various side issues. Journalistic history. Stuart's investigation happened at a time when the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times had culture conflicts and struggles within their newsrooms between those mostly in management who supported the war and those reporters who were getting a little skeptical about the Johnson administration. It affects American society and American politics in terms of the emergence of the credibility gap that undermined Lyndon Johnson. And it also gets at issues, for example, like intelligence and foreign policy. I was able to get secret police files from the Polish archives that document tensions within Polish diplomacy between diplomats who were, pardon the expression, slavishly supportive of Moscow and the Soviet Union, and others who were trying to pursue a more nationalistic agenda and trying to resist the pressures from Polish secret police to act essentially as informers and spies rather than as professional diplomats. So I couldn't resist getting into all of these side stories and dimensions because I found them important and found them fun. But the heart of the story is indeed a peace initiative that the book contends might have succeeded and came closer to succeeding than previous history has realized. So let me briefly describe that and raise a couple of the key issues that the book attempts to deal with. To set the stage, let's go back to the winter of 1966-67. By this point, the U.S. Has engaged almost 400,000 troops in the field. It has suffered a little more, as I said, than 6,000 fatalities. There appears to be no end in sight to escalation. The Vietnam War has vaulted to the forefront of both American politics and world politics. Any of you who were following events at the time can remember this. And unbeknownst to the public, it was also a time when a secret overture, a secret effort to communicate between Washington and Hanoi was going on. Now, again, to set the stage for non-experts, between 1965, when the U.S. dramatically escalated its military involvement in the war, and the spring of 1968, when the Paris peace talks began, the direct discussions between Washington and Hanoi, there were no ongoing direct contacts between the United States and North Vietnam, the major combatants in the war. The United States did not recognize North Vietnam. It recognized South Vietnam. There were no diplomatic relations. And by one State Department count, not just tens or hundreds, but as many as 2,000 attempts were made by third parties to get talks started, to broker negotiations. These range from individuals to institutions to third countries. Some were fly-by-night operations. Some were very seriously prepared diplomatic initiatives. Some were denounced by Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk privately as Nobel Prize seekers, just off to make a name for themselves. Some arguably, were efforts by the Soviet bloc to basically try to get negotiations going because they saw the war increasingly as only benefiting the communist Chinese. But they all failed. The one that I believe had a chance of success that the book described was codenamed Marigold, and it involved a series of secret three-way discussions in Saigon. And I want to mention one of them. On December 3rd, 1966, there was a meeting at 135 Douang Pasteur. And by the way, it's one of the very few French colonial street names that still has the same name, even after first the nationalists and then the communists took over. They renamed Saigon Ho Chi Minh City, of course. They renamed the street the U.S. Embassy was on after Le Duan, the Communist Party leader, or Vietnam Workers' Party leader in North Vietnam, but it's still Douang Pasteur to this day, and it's known for its excellent pho stalls, if anyone is interested. On that day, the Italian ambassador held a meeting, and that was the site of the Italian embassy, and on the fifth floor, the Italian ambassador Giovanni d'Orlandi had an apartment, and he hosted two diplomats. One was Henry Cabot Lodge. Henry Cabot Lodge was, of course, the grandson of the senator who had derailed Woodrow Wilson's effort to get the United States into the League of Nations. He was a grizzled Cold Warrior. He was also a veteran Republican. He had been a Republican senator from Massachusetts until he was unseated by John Kennedy in 1952. He was Dwight Eisenhower's UN ambassador. He ran unsuccessfully for vice president on the ticket with Richard Nixon in 1960. But as a noblesse oblige public servant, he served first John Kennedy and then Lyndon Johnson as U.S. ambassador to South Vietnam. So he was there. The other participant in the Marigold meetings was more of an anomaly. Janusz Lewandowski was a 35-year-old Polish diplomat with the rank of ambassador. The question is, for those of you who are not au courant with this, what the heck was a communist Polish ambassador doing in Saigon, along with a couple of hundred Polish soldiers and a gaggle of military and political advisors? Keep in mind, no communist country in the entire world recognized South Vietnam. This was the enemy. The South Vietnamese government was sharply, deeply anti-communist. Yet, due to a historical accident, there was a Polish diplomatic and military group in downtown Saigon all through the war. And this was a result of the 1954 Geneva Conference that split Vietnam at the 17th parallel, supposedly temporarily for 2 years, pending elections to unify the country. Of course, those elections were never held, and North Vietnam emerged as the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam. South Vietnam emerged as the anti-communist Republic of Vietnam. However, this conference also set up a three-member commission, the International Control Commission, that was intended to monitor the Accord's compliance. Canada represented Western interests, India was the neutral chair, and Poland represented communist interests. And even though by the end of the 50s the Geneva Accords were dead, they were being violated by both sides, no one wanted to pull the plug on the ICC, even though it was hopelessly stalemated, because they thought it might be useful. And so these three countries continued to meet fruitlessly all through the war. But what this meant was that Janusz Lewandowski, who had been given a secret mission by his boss, Polish Foreign Minister Adam Rapacki, to use any opening to promote peace negotiations in Vietnam if he found any, he had a unique capability. For logistical reasons, most of the commission's personnel were located in Saigon, but every couple of months, he could take a rickety plane to Phnom Penh, when then still neutral Cambodia. Then, after lunch, take a flight along a narrow approved corridor up to Vientiane in Laos. And then, after a late afternoon snack, take a nighttime flight across the border to North Vietnam. And if they were not forced to turn back by flak or bombing or other untoward events, and Lewandowski remembered how anti-aircraft fire would sometimes cause heavy drinking on some of these flights, including by the pilot and the crew and the flight personnel. If they managed to make it that far, they would come to a blacked-out Hanoi, and there was an airfield named Geopolitical Airfield that would put on one light, and they would make a nighttime landing. And he would become transformed from Ambassador Lewandowski, which was what he was known in Saigon, to Dong Chi Lewandowski, which is Vietnamese for Comrade Lewandowski. And there he can meet with Ho Chi Minh, Premier Phan Van Dong, Defense Minister Vo Nguyen Giap, and other North Vietnamese, and then come back, reversing his tracks. Well, on December 3rd, 1966, they thought there was a breakthrough for peace. Lewandowski had just come back a few days earlier from a trip to Hanoi. He had 2 days earlier met his two fellow diplomats and brought what he said was a 10-point formulation of the American position, that if the Americans really held to this position, they could confirm this directly to the North Vietnamese ambassador in Poland. Lodge had said, that sounds interesting. He cabled back to Washington for approval. On this day, approval came. He relayed it, and they agreed that a dialogue would start in Warsaw a few days hence. And Lodge later said, I thought I had done something worthwhile in my life. We had a drink on it. Now, there's a historical dispute whether they drank wine or scotch, but they believed a breakthrough had happened. 3 days later was the meeting that was supposed to happen in Warsaw. It had been known prior to this book that the Americans were ready. The American ambassador in Warsaw was at the Polish foreign minister hoping to meet with his North Vietnamese counterpart. No meeting happened. And after a week of suspense and bargaining, the whole thing would collapse. Unknown until now has been the North Vietnamese side of this, and this book tells the story of Nguyen Dinh Phang. He was a North Vietnamese diplomat and interpreter who, in the beginning of December, was summoned to the North Vietnamese Foreign Ministry, and the deputy foreign minister gave him instructions for negotiations with the Americans that he had to personally carry all the way from Hanoi to Warsaw. He was told this was too secret to put in a cable. He was also told that this is so secret that if your plane crashes, you have to destroy this before you die, not after you die. And also, when he went home after the meeting, he had his wife sew it into his vest. He made it to Warsaw, and he told the story, and this has been backed up by some internal Vietnamese sources, that on December 6th, 1966, when the Americans thought that, wait, we're ready, but the North Vietnamese are not, that the North Vietnamese spent the entire day waiting for the American to show up. And I walked it. This was less than a mile away from the Polish foreign ministry, where the U.S. ambassador was talking to the Polish foreign minister. Nguyen Dinh Phang remembers that he and the North Vietnamese ambassador, Do Phac Quang, started the day excited, anticipating that this could be a breakthrough to end the war. Then they were puzzled, and by the end of the day, they were upset. They were angry. They believed the Americans had stood them up. And in the end, the meeting never happened. The reasons would be disputed. The Poles and later anti-war critics, once the story seeped out into the press, would say the Americans blew it. They bombed Hanoi for the first time in 5 months, just on the eve of these discussions. They bungled it at best or deliberately sabotaged it, as some charge at worst. The response of the Johnson administration was this was never a real opportunity. This was a Polish scam, as mentioned. So this book tries to resolve this basic mystery. Was this for real? And the first group of questions that I deal with is this, what one British official who conducted a British postmortem of the affair, which was investigated all over the place, the central enigma of the affair was Poland really authorized by North Vietnam to set up the beginning of direct discussions? Because the Americans pointed out we never had a single direct communication from North Vietnam. For all we know, the Poles were just testing us, trying to get us to reveal our bottom line in negotiations, and essentially acting for advantage for the North Vietnamese to promote the communist cause, not to promote peace. Well, if you go to the website of the National Security Archive, and of course if you read the book, you will see that I think I've conclusively proven that in fact I have conclusively proven that Poland was in fact authorized by North Vietnam authorities, and in particular, after a Politburo debate in November 1966. Pham Van Dong twice met with Lewandowski and authorized this communication, this meeting in Warsaw to happen, and promised that if the Americans really held to this position, as Lewandowski had described it after meeting Lodge in Saigon, that the North Vietnamese would take a positive approach to negotiations and discussions with the Americans. So there's no question that the Poles were serious and that direct talks, I believe, could have started. Now, the next question I deal with is, okay, if this was for real, why did it fail? And I go into some depth into this question, and I'm reminded of a story that Stuart Loory and his co-author first told in the other book on the affair, The Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam in 1968, an interview with someone identified in the book as a close associate of Lyndon Johnson, who this book reveals was actually Bill Moyers after he had left the White House and gone to Newsday. He told the Los Angeles Times inquiring reporter that you will never get the inside story. Why? Because it makes our government look so bad. And indeed, I find that the chief culprit, not the only one as I'll explain, but the most responsible for Marigold's failure was not the U.S. government in general, but Lyndon Johnson in particular, because at the key moment of Marigold, he rejected advice from his senior national security advisors, including Robert McNamara, the defense secretary, Nick Katzenbach, the acting secretary of state, Llewellyn Thompson, senior State Department official, and even Walt Rostow, who was not known as a dove, as those of you who were following the war might remember. They all said, as long as Marigold might have a chance of success, let's not bomb Hanoi anymore. Lyndon Johnson overruled them and said, the Poles are trying to snooker us. A bombing halt was not a precondition for this contact. I'm not going to change the authorization. And the book contends that that was disastrous. However, the book shows that the Poles and the North Vietnamese also bear some of the blame for Marigold's failure. The Poles, I believe, mishandled the diplomacy in Warsaw, and Janusz Lewandowski, when I interviewed him in Warsaw, and I interviewed Lewandowski for about 50 hours over 5 visits to Warsaw, most of it tape recorded, when he saw for the first time the records of what had happened in the dialogue between Gronowski, the American ambassador, and the Polish foreign minister, and also the communications between Poland and the Polish embassy in Hanoi, and records in particular of discussions with Pham Van Dong, the North Vietnamese premier, on December 7th and December 10th, saying, the Americans are bombing Hanoi, they're acting in bad faith, we have to reconsider this whole initiative, but if the American ambassador knocks on the door of our embassy, he will be received. But instead of telling John Gronowski, go knock on their door, Rapotsky continued to bargain to try to get a formal agreement from the Americans not to bomb Hanoi anymore, and also a couple of other issues that had cropped up. By aiming for the perfect resolution, Rapotsky missed a chance to get at least a crossing of the Rubicon and some direct discussions going. And North Vietnam, it was at fault when there was a misunderstanding, apparently, about the meeting. If the North Vietnamese were really ready, why didn't they call the Americans and say, hey, we're here, where are you? Why didn't they call the Poles and say, hey, we're waiting for the Americans, what's the problem? And Nguyen Dinh Phang said the problem was we're the weaker country. We didn't want to seem like we were eager for a meeting. We didn't want to seem like we wanted negotiations so badly. And when Nguyen Dinh Phang, the North Vietnamese diplomat who was present, saw that actually he was wrong, that actually the Americans had wanted the meeting, I mean, he buried his head in his hands and basically believed, he repeated over and over, it is pity, that this was a potentially tragic mistake. The third group of questions I deal with can be summed up as, so what? What if? What if the U.S. and North Vietnamese had this meeting in Warsaw on December 6, 1966, or in the succeeding days? Well, as a judicious historian, or one attempting to be one, you can't say for a established fact that the Vietnam War would have ended a minute sooner or with a single fewer life lost. However, my argument is that Marigold mattered for several reasons. First of all, if direct talks had started, it would have broken the taboo on direct negotiations that made it extremely difficult to surmount the catch-22 that then existed. The U.S. was, of course, bombing North Vietnam since early 1965. North Vietnam endlessly said, we're not going to talk until you stop bombing. The U.S. endlessly said, we're not going to stop bombing until we're assured that we will have prompt and productive negotiations. That could have been broken by the beginning of direct discussions, even if direct negotiations subsequently broke down. Another reason this mattered is that we had long known that the U.S. view of the whole affair was that we were ready, the North Vietnamese weren't. We now know that the Vietnamese view was that the Americans were acting in bad faith. Both sides believed the other was acting in bad faith. And so it was, some people said, why are you writing a 900-page book about something that didn't happen? Well, it was worse than something that didn't happen. Had it never happened, it would have been better. But the result was reinforcing both sides' prejudices against the other and both sides' belief that only military successes could bring diplomatic results. And the result in Hanoi, I argue, is that this was a discrediting of those like Pham Van Dong who were willing, if not quite to give peace a chance, in the lyrics of the John Lennon song, at least to give some kind of probing, some kind of sondage, as he called it in one meeting from the French meeting, for a sounding, a nautical sounding, to give those things a chance when they were told by the hardliners, no, not until we have another Dien Bien Phu will it be time for negotiations. And when Marigold collapsed, the hardliners were able to say, I told you so. It strengthened the hand of the hardliners who said, yes, we need a diplomatic front in our struggle. And January 1967, right after Marigold collapses, you have, again, and my understanding is greatly informed by Merle Prebinow's translation of many of the key Vietnamese documents, you had the North Vietnamese Central Committee and Politburo adopt what becomes known as the Talking While Fighting Resolution. Yes, we need a diplomatic front, but only to underpin and support the military and political struggle in South Vietnam. It's only after Marigold collapses that you see the beginning of a process that in 1967, in the first half of 1967, will begin the planning towards what will become the Tet Offensive in 1968. Would that have happened had direct talks actually begun and instead strengthened those who said, essentially, let's get the Americans out on a red carpet and we can finish the job later, especially essentially a North Vietnamese version of the decent interval idea that is later present in analysis of the Nixon administration's attitude towards Vietnam. So it mattered in Hanoi. In Washington, though, I think there's another consequence of this story. Had direct talks started in December 1966, even if they broke down after a little while, which is entirely possible, and we can get into that in the Q&A if you're interested in what the 10 points at the heart of the supposed agreement to begin talks actually consisted of and whether that would have been feasible. But had talks actually started, this would have undercut the chief critique of Lyndon Johnson from the anti-war left. It is highly unlikely that you would have had Eugene McCarthy or as energetic an anti-war insurgency challenge Lyndon Johnson from inside the Democratic presidency had he been able to say, hey, I got talks started, but they broke down, as opposed to what happened in fact, which was the anti-war left was able to say this administration is insincere, incompetent, or both in seeking peace negotiations. We have to challenge him with an anti-war candidate. Another importance of the story, I contend, is this is a case study of peacemaking and of third-party mediation, interbelligerent communication, various other important aspects of trying to avert, limit, or end wars that repeatedly come up, especially when the U.S., despite the end of the Cold War, has not finished its habit of occasionally getting into foreign crises or actual military interventions or full-scale wars with enemies it doesn't completely understand, sometimes across fairly vast chasms of language, culture, ideology, and history. And this book may have some, if not simplistic lessons, at least some cautionary tales to tell for those future peacemakers who are dealing with complex international issues and having to communicate using third parties and third countries with what can go right, what almost worked, and also what can go wrong. And I'd like to finish on a sort of happy note, which is I thought this book was done about 8 years ago when I had written several hundred pages, mostly based on documents. And then I discovered that Janusz Lewandowski was still alive in Poland, that he was only 35 in 1966. And so I ended up going to Poland, as I mentioned, and interviewing him repeatedly. And my last visit was this past May, and he had turned 80, but his health was a little bit shaky. I hadn't spoken to him in several months, but I'm happy to say that I called him this morning. He had received a copy of the book and was reading it, and had just become a grandfather for the first time. So I'd just like to end by sending off my best wishes to all past and future peacemakers, and hope that they have better results than they did during Marigold. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Jim. Fred?
Absolutely. You can borrow it.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be with you and to have a chance to participate in this panel. And I guess a special thrill for me, because I have seen this project, maybe not quite from the beginning, but from a very early stage, because you see, Jim and I happened upon a scheme whereby we have read one another's draft chapters. So, and I was, of course, desperately hoping that my book would be out before Jim's. Did not happen. But I have seen this project develop, and I want to just make a couple of general remarks and then zero in on really the question of this missed chance and how we should interpret it. But just a couple of general remarks. As Christian said at the outset, this is an absolutely marvelous piece of scholarship, and I don't use that phrase lightly. The research base is almost... Well, it's very hard to believe that Jim has gone to the number of archives that he's gone to, that he's conducted the interviews, some of which he referred to now, and has taken this massive evidence and reduced it and made it into a compelling, powerful narrative. One of the things that those of us who teach, one of the things we tell our students who do research is that's a key task, to be able to take a bunch of documents, a bunch of material, and render it into a powerful narrative, and Jim does it to great effect in this book. And he is truly, it seems to me, a master prose stylist. And so it was a pleasure to read draft chapters, and then, of course, now to see the book published. In terms of the broad claims, I think that Jim Hershberg is very persuasive, entirely persuasive, in arguing for the historical importance of Marigold. Not every specialist will ultimately agree that the enterprise represented a genuine lost chance for peace, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But I think even the skeptics will have to agree upon reading the book that the effort was a serious one, that it has received insufficient attention from students of the war, and that the kind of close examination that Jim has undertaken here of the Marigold initiative tells us not just a lot about the initiative itself, which is a fascinating story, expertly told, but it also tells us a lot about the international history of the war at a particularly important juncture. That is the juncture between the large-scale escalation of the war in 1965 and, let's say, the Tet Offensive of early 1968. It's not quite right to say that this is sort of the lost phase of the war in terms of scholarship, but it certainly has received, I think, less sustained attention than the earlier period, and then, of course, the last years of the war. More broadly, I think we need more international history of the war in this particular period. We need more on the diplomacy of the war. We need to know if there were opportunities and investigate if there were opportunities in this period to bring about a negotiated settlement to the conflict. Were there alternatives to the massive Americanization that occurred between 65 and 68 and that was matched, at least to a substantial degree, by the DRV? Might the escalation have been stopped at a relatively early point before the massive bloodshed? I think these are really important questions, and they are in many ways at the heart of this book. And I'm persuaded, I'll be very interested to see what others make of the core arguments in the book. But I'm persuaded that the U.S. government, in particular, missed a major chance to open talks with North Vietnam in late 1966. This is, again, as Jim pointed out, at a relatively early stage. About 90% of those Americans who would be killed in Vietnam would be killed after this point. And we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives that were taken after, Cambodian and Laotian lives, obviously, in very large numbers. So history, I think Jim is suggesting, could have been different. And I think he also hinted at the fact that it's not just in terms of the war that history could have been different, but also in American domestic politics, in terms of Lyndon Johnson's political career and the election of 1968. But here's what I want to focus on, just for a few minutes. How real was the chance? Let's talk about that for a little bit. Most negotiating efforts in this period failed, as Jim points out. Really never had any chance of succeeding. Skeptics had said prior to the escalation that once the blood really starts to flow, it'll be much harder to get the two sides to sit down at the table and talk, and I think that proved to be certainly correct. Too much credibility was at stake. There had to be a justification on the part of by policymakers of the lives that had already been lost. This, by the way, in writing this history mostly of the French War, I've found the same thing with respect to the French. Paris officials, year after year, said, "We don't really believe in this war," they would say privately. "We don't think we can beat the Viet Minh, but too many French lives have been lost. Too much credibility is at stake. We cannot pull out at this point." So it does raise the question for me about, and maybe Jim can talk, or we can all talk a little bit further about how real this, how close we were. This unrealized alternative, is it one that we can really speak of as being close to happening? I think Jim said earlier, I wrote this down, he said, this was a missed chance that came closer to succeeding than previous accounts have suggested. How close is something I'd like to talk further about. You know, I wrote a book, in fact, presented in this very room 10 years ago on a book I wrote called Choosing War. And it occurred to me that in writing that book, I knocked down one inevitability thesis. And that inevitability thesis said any president would have done what Lyndon Johnson did in 1964 and 65, given the domestic context, given the international context. It was bound to occur. I think I showed in that book that that was not the case. But in the process of knocking down that inevitability thesis, in a way I constructed another one. I don't say this in the book, but and that one says that given this particular set of policymakers, and maybe in particular this president, it's hard to imagine a different outcome than the one that occurred. And I wonder if that might also apply or I'd be interested to know what Jim would say in response to that. That given in particular Lyndon Johnson's presence in the White House, can we speak of this as being something that was very close to being realized? I'm also thinking about Robert McNamara in this context. I'm gathering materials for a book on McNamara, and he's a very interesting case, and of course features in Jim's book. But McNamara, I believe, was never a true believer on the war. I think that Robert McNamara was a skeptic on Vietnam in 1963 under Kennedy. I think he was a skeptic in 64 and 65. And yet, as we all know, he was nevertheless a fierce, maybe not a passionate, but certainly a strong advocate and proponent of the Americanization that occurred. We all know, and Jim talks about this, about McNamara's growing doubts. And yet, McNamara goes along, if you will, with this U.S. response in the key days, the key weeks in question. He was deeply troubled by late '66 by late 1966 regarding the destructiveness of the war, and yet nothing came of it. So I hope we can talk a little bit about what a missed chance means in this context. It's a counterfactual question, but I am a big believer in counterfactual analysis by historians when it's carefully done. And I think that it can actually lead to increased understanding of history. And I do think we need to really probe, and I'd be interested in hearing from Jim more about how much closer did we come than other authors have suggested. I had more things that I wanted to say, but I'll save some of those for later, and I thank you.
Thanks a lot. Mr. Loory.
So let me start by saying that I was fortunate enough to work in Washington in the 1960s during what I consider to be the golden age of American journalism. The Los Angeles Times was a newspaper that was seeking to achieve greatness. It was the feeling of Otis Chandler, the publisher of the paper, the very young publisher of the paper, that the New York Times and the Washington Post, two East Coast papers, did not have to be predominant, and that the Times could challenge them. I was invited to cover the White House by the LA Times. I had been working previous to that at the New York Herald Tribune, and my boss at the Herald Tribune went to work for the Times, and he invited me to, as the Washington bureau chief, and he invited me to cover the White House. Shortly after I joined the LA Times bureau in January of 1967, the stories that Jim talked about appeared first in the Washington Post, and then in the New York Times, and then there was also a major Associated Press story at the time talking about the possibilities of a bungled peace initiative having taken place. David Kraslow, who was the deputy bureau chief, got very interested in this story, and he was one of the original good investigative reporters in Washington. And in talking to his sources, he learned that there had been an initiative named Marigold. And he came back to the office and he said to me, "Loory, you know what a marigold is?" And I said, "Yes, David, my wife grows them, and they are beautiful little orange flowers, and we have them outside our house every spring." And he said, "Loory, Marigold was a peace initiative that failed. And it was an initiative involving, he knew very little about the story then, but involving a breakdown in negotiations." And he said, "There is a good story here, and it has not yet been told." And he said, "I think we can write a book about it." I was used to writing a long story. For me in those days was maybe 20 paragraphs. And even that was too long for my editors. And he said, "Loory, we will get permission from the LA Times to write the book. And we will get permission to take as much time as we needed, and you will be relieved of all of your daily duties at the White House, and I will take time off from my editing duties, and we'll do the book." And sure enough, David went to the editor of the paper, Nick Williams in Los Angeles, and to the publisher, Otis Chandler, and they said, "Yes, do it. And all we want is when you are finished with the book, just give us a series of stories before the book is published." And with that, we went to Random House. And Random House was also interested in the book, and we signed a contract with Random House to write. And then the question became, how do you get the story? We did not have the same opportunity that Jim had 40 years later to go to the archives and dig out all of the information and then go interview people who had produce those archives to get the story. The way to get the story, of course, was to talk to people, to sources. Jim termed them leaks. I take a little umbrage at the use of the word leaks, because they weren't leaks. We really had to dig and probe and ask questions over and over and over again and find the people who would tell us. One of the first people we found, I can now tell you, was the Assistant Secretary of State at the time, Nick Katzenbach. And Nick Katzenbach was from the Kennedy administration and from the Department of Justice in the Kennedy administration, and David knew him very well. One of the things we discovered from Nick was that at the time that the Marigold initiative was to produce the meeting between John Gronowski and the North Vietnamese ambassador in Warsaw, the United States bombed Hanoi for the first time in 6 months. And the opening of this book tells the story of an unnamed American official going to his front doorstep in Cleveland Park on December 3rd, the day that Jim has mentioned, and picking up his Washington Post and seeing the headline story, the off-lead story of the Post, saying that for the first time in 6 months, the United States has bombed Hanoi. And the official said, and we quote him, "Oh my God, we lost control." He knew that this meeting had been talked about and was going to take place in Warsaw, and he said the North Vietnamese said to himself, the North Vietnamese are really going to be very disturbed about this, and it may, as a result of this, result in the cancellation of that meeting or the postponement. In my notes, we couldn't, and the reason I tell this story is because this is an unsourced story in the book. Who's a high-level American official? It can be anybody, but we knew who it was. The name, and Jim will have to correct me if I'm wrong about this, but in my notes, the name Nick Katzenbach appears. And the first person to find out about it years later was Jim Hershberg, who got access to all of my papers, which are being held at the University of Wyoming. Jim talked to David Kraslow, and David said, "You can't mention Nick Katzenbach's name." Nick Katzenbach is now in his late 90s and living in Princeton, New Jersey, and Jim went to interview him. And being a very good journalist, as well as a terrific scholar, he knew how to question sources also. And he questioned the source to say, "Do you know anything about what happened on December 3rd when an American official went to his front doorstep and picked up the paper and said, 'Oh my God, we lost control'?" And Nick Katzenbach said, "I think what I actually said was, 'Oh shit, we lost control.'" Okay, so a very good journalist as well as a scholar had Nick Katzenbach on the record as being the source for that story. The intent of our investigation was to determine how sincere the Johnson administration was in trying to find a negotiated settlement to the war, whether when Lyndon Johnson was saying that he would go anywhere and speak to anyone about anything to achieve a settlement, whether he was really sincere or whether he actually wanted to nail the coonskin to the wall and win the war. And to do that, we interviewed dozens of people around the world. and mentioned very few of the names in this book. People ranging from Averell Harriman, who was one of Johnson's leading negotiators or people trying to establish negotiations, to Janusz Lewandowski in Warsaw and Giovanni Dorlandi, the Italian ambassador in Rome, and Bobby Kennedy and J. William Fulbright, and on and on and on. We saw only one classified document. And that was a document that was given to us by at the insistence of Senator Fulbright by Carl Marcy of the Chief of Staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and that was the report by John Gronowski of what had happened in Warsaw and why the meetings did not take place. As a result of that, we had very good notes on Gronowski's meetings. And when I went to Warsaw and I met with Gronowski and I started asking him questions, he said, "Where did you get all this information?" And I couldn't tell him that I got the information from him. Because I couldn't divulge sources, and I said, "Mr. Ambassador, I can't tell you who my sources were, and if you don't want to be quoted, we won't quote you. So let's talk." I had the same experience with Outant when we interviewed him. I got, luckily, Outant's telephone number from his office. He was out of the office at the time, and I called him up and got him on the phone and said, "Mr. Secretary General, we have been trying to come to see you about your involvement in establishing negotiations, and we cannot get an appointment." And he said, "How did you get my telephone number?" And I said, "Mr. Secretary General, I can't tell you. I can't divulge sources. And if you talk to us and you don't want to be quoted, we won't quote you." He said, "Well, that's very interesting." He said, "Because, this is not my telephone number. I'm visiting my daughter and my grandchildren." And somehow his secretary had mistakenly given us the number where he was at that moment. So we had a good interview with Outant. I had an interview with Averell Harriman, and I went to Harriman's Georgetown home. And I was relatively young and relatively unsophisticated, and I walked into a room and sat down waiting for Harriman, and there were Van Gogh paintings hanging on the walls, and it was the seat of great luxury and heritage. And I started talking to Harriman, and I would ask him questions, and that was a very unsatisfactory interview because he said, when I asked him one question, and I don't remember now what it was, "That's none of your goddamn business, and I'm not going to tell you." So not everything was easy, but slowly getting to people, we did piece together a story based only on interviews. And I will not pretend to tell you that we followed any kind of two-source rule, because if we trusted our sources and it was just one source, the information that we got went into the book. We finished the book the night that Lyndon announced his intention not to run, March 31st, 1968. The book was published and distributed by July 4th, 1968. This was also the era, which continues now, of so-called quickie books, and this book was a quickie. One of the other reasons that we did it was the year before we had done a book, the entire were asked by the New American Library to do a book on the Six-Day War that they wanted to get out in 10 days. And we did it. And that's how we learned that a book like this could be done accurately, and could be done quickly. When the Pentagon Papers story broke in 1971, I was asked by a disenchanted deputy of Henry Kissinger, who had become an advisor to Daniel Ellsberg after Ellsberg was indicted, to be an expert witness for the defense at the Ellsberg trial. And the reason for that was that Mort Halpern saw that much of the stuff in the diplomatic volume of the Pentagon Papers, which Ellsberg had never released because he felt that this would hurt the possibility of any diplomatic effort to negotiate a settlement to the war. But he was indicted for releasing the diplomatic volume because the government felt that it had the strongest case against him if they could say that he was harming national security and the national interest. So it was my job to read the diplomatic volume, which did become public information because the government indicted him for releasing it, so they had to put the diplomatic volume on file in the United States Courthouse in Los Angeles, as well as the other volumes. So I had the opportunity to read the Pentagon Papers, compare what the Pentagon Papers said with our book that had been published 3 years before, and I discovered, much to my great satisfaction, that we were pretty accurate. I like to say that in baseball, if a hitter bats over 300, he is a Hall of Fame candidate. That means he's right 1 in 3 times at bat. And my guess, my assessment, my self-centered assessment was that we were batting at least 800 and maybe more, and that was very satisfying. 40 years later, when I read Jim's marvelous work, and incidentally, I want to repeat everything that Professor Logevall had said about that book. He is not only a scholar, and a magnificent scholar, but he is a journalist, and he is a great writer. And the book reads in a compelling way, like a great piece of investigative reporting. But at any rate, what I learned from all of the documentation that Jim uncovered was that, yes, we were pretty accurate. One of the things that we were interested in, and that Jim did not emphasize in his talk, was the manner in which secrecy in the United States government was destructive. The Johnson administration was so secretive about what was going on in the attempts to establish negotiations that one hand did not tell the other hand what was going on. Lyndon Johnson and Dean Rusk and Robert S. McNamara and Maxwell Taylor, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, used to meet Tuesdays in the White House for lunch. And at those Tuesday lunches, they would pick the targets that authorized the Air Force and the United States Navy to use as targets in Vietnam. And sometime in the fall of 1967, they authorized the bombing of targets in the Hanoi area. Because of bad weather and other considerations, the targets could not be hit until December, the same time that the meetings were supposed to take place in Warsaw. The United States Air Force and the Navy never knew what was happening on the diplomatic front. And as a result of that, the bombing went forward. And that's why there was this tremendous controversy over whether or not it was the bombing that forced the cancellation of any talks in Warsaw. There was that kind of thing throughout the Vietnam War. The United States prided itself on how good its intelligence gathering was, and what great use they made of it, and in almost all the time, the North Vietnamese had much better intelligence on what was happening in Saigon and in the United States government than the other way around. Not in this book, but in another book, I wrote a story about how at one point General Patton's son, Colonel, I think his name was George S. Patton Jr., maybe, who was a brigade commander or battalion commander in Vietnam, led an expedition into the jungle one day, and he came back and he said, "I don't understand it." He said, "We were out in the jungle, and what we found hanging from trees in the jungle were helmets full of urine." He used the word piss. And he said, what was going on there? What he didn't know was that the United States had developed a sensor that sensed ammonia. And if there was ammonia, that meant there was urine, and that meant that the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese army, was in the jungle, and they used that for artillery fire into the jungle or bombings. And the North Vietnamese knew about these sensors, and what they did, of course, was to deflect the intelligence gathering just by hanging buckets of urine, which emanated a lot of ammonia in parts of the jungle where they were not. And that was the kind of thing that was happening, and it was the kind of thing that we wrote about somewhat in the book about the poor intelligence. And as a result of that, we got a story not only about the negotiation and the failed negotiation, but an important story, I always felt, on how the United States government operates and how things should be corrected and turned around so that it operates in a more cohesive and coordinated and better way. And I think that's a story, just as the diplomatic story was important then, is still important now, because there are lessons that have never been learned that as a result have resulted in many different disasters, including what's going on, of course, now in Afghanistan and what was going on in Iraq. With that, I will stop, because I'm sure that there will be a lot of good comments and questions.
Thank you so much for these fascinating and thoughtful comments, both of you, Fred and Stuart Loory. I do want to give Jim a chance to respond, but perhaps we'll take I thought we'll take a couple of questions, or a question, and then you can add your further comments in response. So The floor is open. If you please wait for the microphone and state your name and affiliation if you like. Yes.
Hello, this is Francisco Rodriguez from George Washington University. Well, congratulations for the interesting presentation on the book. And regarding when you talk about stereotype and prejudice in both sides, I would like if you could please elaborate more about that, about like after the publication of Orientalism by Said in '69, there are several work on how emotion or how prejudice have affected to U.S. foreign policy. So if you could please elaborate a bit more about that. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Jim. Respond to that.
Okay, first let me just say a few words to respond to the commentators. Thank you very much to both of you. Response to Fred's about how real it was. Obviously that's impossible to establish precisely, although like Fred, I engage explicitly in some counterfactual analysis. If you actually get to the concluding chapter, you'll see Ideal citing Fred's analysis of this methodology, with the question of, okay, so what? So if they had met, what would have happened? What if? But trying to link Fred's comments together in terms of, well, how real was the opportunity? Let me just cite someone who Henry Cabot Lodge spoke to on July 1st, 1968. By that time, he had left Saigon, and he had been appointed actually as Lyndon Johnson's ambassador to West Germany. He was in Bad Godesberg, near Bonn. And a U.S. official, well, a recently retired U.S. official happened to pass by, and they discussed Vietnam, and they discussed Marigold. And the former official said, well, in late 1966, he had high hopes for Marigold, and he believed that they might have shortened the war by 2 years. But that the American bombing had changed Hanoi's attitude and caused the collapse. And I'm sure you read it in one of those drafts many years ago, but that official was Robert McNamara. And Robert McNamara, this is why there are many Robert McNamaras, contemporary documents, memories, etc. Later on, wouldn't give Marigold the time of day. He basically in his books, co-authored on the war, he basically just completely ignored it. And I believe my colleague Svetlana Savranskaya once asked him, and he just gruffly dismissed it as being of no importance. At the time, however, and there's also a memo that he wrote to Lyndon Johnson in March 1967, in which he committed the heresy of saying, actually, our bombing caused Hanoi to back away, and it was our fault that Marigold didn't go for it. He thought it was serious. So for whatever that's worth, at least some highly placed officials seem to who were not exactly necessarily doves on the war in general, seem to think it might have been serious. Let me just say quickly in response to Stu a couple of things. First of all, thank you for correcting the record. That New York Times, so there weren't two different ones. The New York Times story on Marigold in May 1967 was in fact written by John M. Hightower of the Pulitzer Prize-winning national security correspondent of the Associated Press, and was sort of a confession of failure by the New York Times. They had not produced their own exposition of the affair, and they published above the fold of their front page the AP story. And the irony, which the book goes into, is that the Washington Post editorially supported the war. And in fact, it's a little-known trivia question that LBJ's last UN ambassador was actually the former editorial page editor of the Washington Post, Russell Wiggins. LBJ used to say, one of his editorials is worth 3 battalions to me. And so you had this odd case of the Washington Post editorially supporting the war, and yet its front page revealed Marigold with an anti-administration spin, quoting an unidentified source, which the book, of course, discloses was the Danish ambassador to the United Nations, as saying the Americans bungled it. And actually, Dean Rusk then called up Russell Wiggins and said, your guy got it wrong. It's just wishful thinking and commie disinformation. And so a few days later, the Washington Post editorial page wrote an editorial saying, in effect, to the readers, don't believe our front page, even though the reporter was actually his own protege at the newspaper. And then, 3 months later, after the counter-leaking, John Hightower wrote a pro-administration version that was published on the front page of the New York Times, which editorially had turned against the war already. So it was somewhat ironic. And just briefly, actually, your notes of that conversation with Katzenbach that day did not tell me who it was. It said, from source N this day, deep background, no attribution. But, there were ways to find out. And one story that you didn't mention, I didn't mention, but the book is called "The Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam." So inevitably, I have a chapter called "The Secret Search for the Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam." Stu did not mention that in the summer of 1967, for months, he and David Kraslow were stonewalled by administration officials. Walt Rostow said, "Hey, Hightower already got that story. You're barking up the wrong tree. You're going nowhere." Then a funny incident happened. I won't tell the long version, but it was one fun part of talking about the investigations or leaks, you may call them both, and I do not mean to cast aspersion on your investigative skills, is that it brings characters into the narrative who were not necessarily involved in Watergate, in Marigold. And on October 2nd, 1967, David Kraslow, who had been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard, came up and visited Henry Kissinger in his office. And Kissinger, although he was not yet National Security Advisor, had been consulting for the State Department, and unbeknownst to Kraslow, was also a consultant who had a chance to examine, and Les Gelb told me about this, the record of Marigold that had been compiled for the Pentagon Papers. So what happened was, for about a half hour, an hour, Kraslow tried to get something out of Kissinger, got nowhere. Kissinger just deflected everything. And then as a throwaway question, and it was delightful, Kraslow told me the story, and his contemporaneous notes confirmed it. He said, "And what do you know about Marigold?" And that name was, of course, completely secret at the time. And both the notes and Kraslow fondly remember that Kissinger's face turned beet red. And he said, "How do you know about Marigold?" And Kraslow basically, at that moment, I knew we had a book. That Marigold was real enough that Kissinger was so upset that we knew that code name. So anyway, it's not just leaks. It's investigation.
Yeah, if I may...
the Said question. That's a far more complex question than Marigold. And actually, I'd recommend Mark Bradley's work for how Vietnamese perceived Americans. Mark Bradley's, I think, is he still in Wisconsin?
He's at the University of Chicago.
Oh, he's moved to Chicago. That's highly complex. Certainly, some of those stereotypes and misunderstandings. I mean, and keep in mind that it was the Vietnamese filtered through the polls. So you had a double set of stereotypes. In fact, there's a Pentagon document saying essentially that ideology runs thicker than blood. The Poles might be white, but they're really communists, and that's what's really driving them. And we have to keep that in mind at all times. Clearly, there was so much accumulated mistrust, distrust on both sides that bringing them even to the brink of a direct meeting to agree on a basis for talks was incredibly difficult, and it did not take too much for both sides to believe the worst of each other, but it can't be attributed to that alone. Does anyone else want to comment on that?
I would just like to follow up on what you said about Henry Kissinger. I first met Henry Kissinger when he was still at Harvard and we were working on the book. And then I was covering the transition to the Nixon administration in New York in December of 1968, when Kissinger was named the National Security Advisor by Nixon. And I called Henry and I said, "Henry, let's get together and talk." And we had breakfast the next morning. And we talked about a lot of things, and it turned out that I was very naive, and Henry was picking my brain on how he should operate in Washington. But at any rate, at the end of the meeting, he said, "Stuart, by the way, I have an article being published in Foreign Affairs about Vietnam negotiations, which I wrote before I knew that I was going to be the National Security Advisor, and it's going to be out next week. And in the article, I give your book a plug." And he gave me a copy of the article, and I read it. And the plug was that there was a footnote in the article saying there have been many contemporaneous reports about attempts to establish negotiations. Mind you, many. We had the only one, I think, a good one. And he said, see, for example, Loory and Kraslow, The Secret Search for Peace in Vietnam. And I called him up and I said, "Henry, you call that a plug?" Then, as time went on, and he got to the White House, and I was covering the White House, and I was, of course, covering national security affairs. And he said to me one day when I was talking to him, by the way, Stuart, my foreign affairs article is being published in a book with several other articles, and I have corrected the footnote. The new footnote said, there have been many contemporaneous reports. That was not corrected. And he said, for the best of them, see Loory and Kraslow. So I'm sorry to take so much time with that. But
yeah. All right, let's take a couple more questions. Yes, Helge Faro.
Helge Faro, University of Oslo. I haven't read your book. I only got it a couple of hours ago. But I've looked at the index. And I'm wondering why I don't find Ohio in there. Because it followed very closely upon Marigold. And it was an initiative taken by the North Vietnamese in seeing the Norwegian ambassador in Beijing. They traveled to Hanoi several times. There were North Vietnamese in Oslo. And it also had domestic Norwegian ramification, which is of no use for this. But why Ohio is not in your index and presumably then not in the story is a little mysterious.
Okay, just for the rest of you, Ohio and Aspen, actually, were Scandinavian efforts.
Because Aspen is in there, and the Swedes are in the Norwegian.
Yeah, no, you are gaining insight into internecine Scandinavian rivalry, about which Fred knows a great deal, as would Arnie Wested if he were here. Now, the simple reason is one of timing, which is that Aspen, which was a Swedish effort to get negotiations started, coincided and overlapped with the climax of Marigold in November 1966. And so in writing the Marigold story, Aspen naturally comes in. The Ohio story mostly takes place over the course of 1967, and although it involved Chester Cooper, for example, who made a secret trip to Oslo, and Chet Cooper was Avril Harriman's chief aide, and actually he helped on this book. I interviewed him many times, but he unfortunately passed away before the book came out. It was one of a number of subsequent initiatives, including Pennsylvania, which of course involved Henry Kissinger and two French academics in the summer and autumn of 1967. The book was long enough. Essentially, there were so many other misfired initiatives that I couldn't go into them. It may well be mentioned. The index, is excellent, but it may well have been left out. I suspect I referred to it in passing, but it was simply the lack of its direct connection to the Marigold story, whereas Aspen just happened to coincide. In fact, the Swedish foreign minister met with Dean Rusk, and actually I can thank Fred Logevall's excellent article on Aspen in a book that appeared a few years ago, literally the same days that the bombing raids that Stuart Loory mentioned on Hanoi that would eventually torpedo Marigold were being debated. And it even came up in the same meetings that took place in Moscow that I got from the Soviet/Russian archives in late November, in which this diplomacy was. So it was simply a matter of timing, as opposed to Swedish favoritism in any sense.
Hold on, the microphone.
Sorry. But it would have strengthened the conceivable counterfactual arguments that the North Vietnamese actually were quite serious about it, because they were extremely serious. Mm-hmm. But then the track leading to Paris came up, and the Norwegians were shunted aside.
Yeah, I think more comparable to that is actually I do go into some detail into the so-called Keeley Italian initiative in early 1968, named after Jean-Claude Keeley, who had just won 3 gold medals at the Winter Olympics in Grenoble because they thought this could be a champion. It did show, and this reflected and Merle, knows all about this, the Vietnamese decision at the beginning of 1967 that, yes, we should make efforts to begin a diplomatic track that could sort of underpin the more primary military and political efforts in South Vietnam. And I think, it's correct that Ohio reflected this greater willingness for contacts.
I'm afraid I'm going to be one of these tiresome people that makes a statement instead of asking a question, but In the first place, I'm
Please introduce
impressed.
yourself. Just please introduce yourself. Just say your name.
Is this right?
Yep. But just
I'm enormously impressed that you've turned out a 1,000-page book. I just turned out a 250-page book, which I thought was quite an effort. So,
are you Bill Stearman?
what?
Are you William Stearman?
Right. Mhm.
Yes, I just want to introduce a former National Security Council staff advisor and longtime diplomat. And
Surprised you knew that. I mean, you know a lot of things. I know your reputation, which is a very good one. I feel that you make a very good point about the advantage of having taken advantage of the Marigold initiative, if you will, and that is the domestic impact it would have had. It would have helped Lyndon Johnson enormously. But from a long experience, let me just back up a little bit. I've devoted 10 straight years to Vietnam, from the rice paddies to the White House. When it all went down the tubes, I was director of the Indochina staff of the NSC. I was the most senior U.S. official that was only engaged with Indochina. That was from the beginning of '73 to the end of '76. So I have a lot of fairly inside knowledge about negotiations. The problem, Marigold, really, even if it come to fruition, would not have succeeded. There's for a fundamental reason. Hanoi was bound and determined at any cost to take over South Vietnam. And we were bound and determined at that in '66, and I was out in Vietnam in '66, that not happen. So there was hardly any common ground could be reached in negotiating. That was true of the subsequent negotiations, which also had a domestic impact reason. You couldn't. It's difficult to sustain the war effort if you made no effort whatsoever to find peace. But it simply was not in the cards to resolve it that way. And incidentally, I came within seconds of getting killed in 1967. You're talking about all the people that were killed after '66. Well, I came very close to being one of them. That's beside the point. Now, what finally happened, and this is all the great the irony of negotiations. In the end, South Vietnam was on the verge, or North Vietnam was on the verge of defeat. They launched an offensive, called Easter Offensive in '72, with 23 divisions and tanks, long-range artillery, the whole works. Very impressive operation. They captured only one provincial capital. They lost 100,000 killed in action, which is actually more than twice the Americans killed in action in the entire Vietnam War. After that was where they were on the ropes, and later Tron Van Tra, who was one of the top commanders in the South, in a series of articles in Yun Zun after they had won the war in '75, admitted that they were on the ropes or on the verge of defeat. So what they used negotiations to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. They got Henry, which was easy to do, get Henry, my boss, get him involved in negotiations. He was big on negotiations. So he made, I think, a very fundamental mistake of getting engaged in negotiations in October is really when the first feelers came. But he was in a difficult position, too, because he couldn't come out and be against negotiations. It's like begin against peace or motherhood or what have you. So he...
Could you sort of bring your remarks to a point?
Better?
No, if you could bring your comments to an end or pose the question so that...
I'll bring them quickly to an end because, in other words, they through the agreement that was reached as a result of that led to South Vietnam's defeat and and to North Vietnam's victory. And so that was, they finally through negotiations won the war. You read my book, there's a lot more detail in it than that. Well, I'm sorry to take so much time, but I think it's important to show the other side of this whole picture.
Thank you very much. Jim, a reaction?
Very briefly, thank you very much for your comments. I will look forward to seeing your book. First of all, the whole debate about the winnability of the war, is a massive topic for another panel. But on the question of whether Marigold had a chance of succeeding, you're entirely right. There would have been many potential causes for the talks to break down, and there's no question that I don't imply that North Vietnam's willingness to engage in talks did not mean it was giving up its long-range project of taking over all of Vietnam under communist rule. The question is whether there might have been some kind of opportunity to have some kind of agreement that would have led to a political process that would have enabled the U.S. to extricate itself. And again, what I'm talking about is, we've long had the debate about whether or not during the Nixon administration there was a decent interval approach. What has gotten much less attention, which my book attempts to raise, is whether some North Vietnamese had the same idea. Get the Americans out, and then we can be patient before we finish the job, due to the cost of the war to the North Vietnamese. And the 10 points, which were at the heart of Marigold, included some indicators of more American willingness to, for example, allow South Vietnam to become neutral, not all of Vietnam. It repeated the pledge LBJ had made that within 6 months of a settlement, all American forces and facilities and basing rights would be taken out. And what's interesting is, there are some little pieces of evidence that people like William Bundy and some others, who were committed to victory in Vietnam, were recognizing that a settlement might not be ironclad in terms of permanently assuring a non-communist government in Saigon, that there might be some amount of possibility, 15%, 20%, that eventually the communists would take over. The question was, they were beginning to see that we might have to swallow that to get out of there, and that's all the book suggests, the possibility. It doesn't say the war would have ended, but it does say that direct discussions could have started.
Thank
you.
Thank you. Feng-Chia.
Feng-Chia. I'm a fellow here at the center. Otherwise, I teach at Long Island University in Brooklyn, New York. Thank you, Jim, for a good presentation in the book. And in your book, you mentioned about the Sinos with the split and the Vietnam War, I guess. And my question is, could you talk a little bit about the rule of the Sino? Could you talk a little bit about the Sino-Soviet split and its impact on the Vietnamese revolutionaries? Because now I think there are two major contending views. One is like Tom Christensen of Princeton. In his 2001 book, he said that this was a godsend. He basically said godsend for the revolutionaries around the world. The Sino-Soviet split was a godsend opportunity because the Vietnamese and other revolutionaries, the Chinese and the Soviets, they competing to provide economic and military aid. But on the other hand, the 2005 book by Arnie Westad, now he's The Global Cold War, in that he said that the Sino-Soviet split was a setback and not an advantage for the Vietnamese communists. So what's your view on this issue? Thank you.
Sure. I mean, this is a massive and fascinating issue. And again, another reason the book got so long is because I think it is so important and underexplored, this very complicated interrelationship between the Vietnam War and the concurrent split. Basically, the 1960s can be viewed as the path from the Sino-Soviet split by the end of the 50s and beginning of the 60s to the Sino-American opening at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s, despite being on opposite sides of the Vietnam War. These are massive tectonic shifts in international affairs, and their interrelationship, is crucial, and yet you really need communist archives to explore. Now, on the question that you raised, was the Sino-Soviet rift a benefit or a drawback for revolutionary? There's no question that most communist sources indicate that they actually blamed the massive American escalation on the fact of disunity in the communist movement, that the communists were vulnerable instead of being united, and that this encouraged the Americans to intervene. Now, the American sources don't back that up, but what's fascinating in terms of Marigold is something that I haven't mentioned but is explored in the book, which is the impact of the expansion of the Cultural Revolution in China in the summer of 1966, which basically threw China into chaos in the summer and fall of 1966. And to the Soviets and the Poles and other observers in Hanoi and dealing with Hanoi, and of course the Soviets and the Chinese were both backing Hanoi, but the North Vietnamese were regularly having summits with the Soviets. They believed that the Chinese turning inward opened up an opportunity for negotiations. Why? Because the Chinese were endlessly proclaiming that the only way to deal with the imperialists is to defeat them militarily, armed struggle until total victory. You know, this is when you have shrill comments like Mao basically calling on the countryside to take over the cities of the world in a global revolution. But that because the Chinese were distracted, that this enabled those in Hanoi who favored negotiations to be emboldened in their position. But one thing that's fascinating that came out of the Chinese archives is just before Marigold, literally November 9th, 10th, 11th, 1966, Logevall took a secret trip to China. And the Chinese archives confirm an anecdote which I actually got from a Polish document from the Polish ambassador in Hanoi, quoting an unnamed Vietnamese source. I'm not sure. I suspect it was more leaking than his investigative skills, because this particular diplomat was seen as not the most enterprising diplomat. But he had heard something that only just before I finished the book was I able to confirm from a Chinese source, which is that Logevall had told the Chinese, we think we need to accede to talks. We need to enter negotiation. The interesting thing is, first he told Zhou Enlai this, and Zhou repeated the party line saying, no, you must battle until total victory. Then he talked to Mao, and Mao said, disregard what you said, what Zhou Enlai said. You're the ones fighting and shedding the blood. We will support you whatever you do. So he more or less gave his blessing, the sort of bad cop, good cop act. But the North Vietnamese did their best to keep all of this secret from the Chinese and from the NLF, for fear that they would sabotage this, because they believed in armed struggle, not negotiations. But anyway, I encourage you to read the book, because you will find a lot on that aspect.
Okay, the gentleman there.
Piotr Długołęcki. I'm historian at the Polish Institute of International Affairs in Warsaw. I would like to ask about Polish-Russian relationship connected with this peace initiative. You mentioned that the Poles were authorized by North Vietnam. Could you say a few words about more important authorization given by Russian?
Yeah, no, this is a major sub-theme of the book, and I have to say that the analysts of the Pentagon Papers, for example, after saying, you know, the central mystery was Poland authorized to set up this meeting, was, well, what was the nature of Polish-Soviet coordination? Was this a Soviet project that the Poles were merely carrying out? For example, one of Lyndon Johnson's NSC aides basically said this was a KGB disinformation plot. You know, this was a script written in Moscow. The Poles were just doing what the Soviets told them to do. What I found is something somewhat more complicated, which is the Poles carefully ascertained what Moscow's preferences were. And during this point of the war, the Soviets preferred negotiations because they saw the war as benefiting the Chinese. But the Soviets did not want to get in front, pushing the North Vietnamese, because then that would lay them open to accusations from both the Chinese and hardliners in Hanoi that they were towing the imperialist line, that they were colluding with the Americans. The Soviets only in 1967 started getting directly involved in trying to mediate between Washington and Hanoi. During this period of the war, what they would do is give the Hungarians or the Poles or anyone else in the Warsaw Pact who wanted to give it a whirl their blessing. The Czechs tried half-heartedly at one point in the story, and basically said, you know, good luck, you know, to you. You've got our blessings. But the Poles had their own motives. They knew it fit Soviet policy preferences, but I go into these motives at some length. For example, escalation of the war in Vietnam, they believed, threatened détente in Europe. They wanted better relations, political and especially economic, with the West Europeans. They wanted better relations with the Americans. And, what way to do this better than to play a pivotal role in achieving, an acceptable resolution to the war. Adam Rapatsky was not without an ego. He didn't mind the idea of gaining credit on the international diplomatic stage. But it's a very tense, sometimes, connection. At one point, the Soviets are even jealous that the Poles are doing better than they are at communicating with the North Vietnamese. But there are also tensions within the Polish foreign ministry between Janusz Lewandowski, who my research indicates was sincerely trying to promote peace while also being a loyal communist, and other diplomats, especially Poland's ambassador in Hanoi, who was so obsequious to his Soviet colleague that he felt whatever he knew he had to try to use to tell the Soviets and get in better with them. And this led to some tensions within the Polish foreign ministry about how closely they had to follow the Soviet line and whether they had to coordinate and inform the Soviets at absolutely every step. So, this is something. The bottom line is the Soviets didn't tell them to do it. The Poles did it on their own, but only after carefully ascertaining at each important step that what they did fit the Soviet views. And actually, when they first get word in a cable from Saigon to Warsaw to the Polish foreign minister that the Americans have come in with new proposals that might be more appealing to start negotiation, the very first thing that Adam Rapatsky does, he receives a cable on November 17th, 1966, is he gets a plane and flies on an emergency basis to a long-scheduled Bulgarian Communist Party Congress in Sofia. Why? Because Leonid Brezhnev is there. And I have the records of their meetings. He goes and informs Brezhnev of the American proposals, gives him a copy of the cables, gets Brezhnev's blessing. Brezhnev even said, well, this is the most the Americans can offer. Go ahead. Do your best. And so, once he's got that, Poles know, hey, it's off to the races. But it's a mixture of doing the Soviet bidding, but also, with a little bit of Poles' own agenda and motivation. But I encourage you to read. I'm obviously simplifying greatly.
All right. For the final question, I'd like to turn to Fred Logevall.
Thank you. It occurred to me, Jim, that you're as well situated to answer this question as perhaps anybody. And the question is this. In terms of let's say the period, the fall of 66 into early 67, at the highest levels of the U.S. policymaking establishment on Vietnam, if you can generalize, and of course you deal with this in the book, but maybe you can tell us a little bit here, what's the thinking about the prospects in Vietnam? And it goes back, I guess, to my comment about McNamara. My sense is, Jim, and this is one of the reasons I have a problem with the argument that the war was winnable in a meaningful sense, and that in fact the United States was on the road to victory. My sense is that there's just a lot of pessimism at various levels of the American policymaking establishment, and I mentioned McNamara already. LBJ himself, I think, had basically decided that Vietnam was going to be the end of him. Of course, in the CIA and elsewhere, there is this certainly lack of optimism about the prospects. Could you give a sense of a snapshot or just a brief sense of what top officials or mid-level officials are thinking about whether this thing can succeed? Because it goes to the question of negotiations.
Of course.
Or ought to.
And one thing that's fascinating, by the way, is finding on the Polish side and the Soviet side repeated evidence that they don't think the war is winnable from Hanoi's perspective. They're constantly telling the North, you can't beat the Americans, be realistic. That's an extremely complex question. We're dealing with multiple bureaucracies, and obviously there's a range of opinions. Nevertheless, I think at the highest levels, excepting, of course, the uniformed military, which is, resolutely hawkish and basically saying, just let us do the job. Stop with all these bombing halts. Stop with all these limitations. Just let us hit all the target. You are clearly seeing rising doubt in key places. This is a fascinating moment because not only do you have McNamara clearly becoming more and more doubtful about the efficacy of bombing, but on October 3rd, 1966, Nick Katzenbach replaces George Ball as Deputy Secretary of State. Katzenbach had actually been a bombardier in the war, and he actually accompanies McNamara to South Vietnam a week later. And he doesn't let on publicly. Publicly, everyone's saluting the flag. But he is very quickly becoming doubtful about the efficacy of bombing and the idea that they're going to get 100%. But what's striking is even a figure like William Bundy, who is he is Dean Rusk's right-hand man on the war. I mean, they're connected umbilically, in terms of Vietnam policy, is writing a memo saying, we're going to have to settle for less than 100% of what we're looking for. And we've got and actually one thing that's fascinating is during Marigold, there is a negotiations committee meeting every few days in Governor Harriman's office, actually. And they're debating the question of, well, okay, and only some of the people at the table know about Marigold. What should our bottom line be? What should our ultimate bargaining position be? And, at certain points, the White House is afraid that this effort is going to go off the reservation. That's when the White House sends Bill Jordan, that some of you might remember. He became sort of Walt Rostow's. He was a former reporter for the New York Times, but he became a resolute hawk. It sounded a little bit like Newt Gingrich in recent debates in terms of denouncing the elite press on Vietnam. But he becomes Rostow's watchdog to make sure that too many concessions don't get into the mix. But, increasingly, even though there's more escalatory options on the table that are going to be embraced after Marigold fails, just like the North Vietnamese are going to start moving towards Tet, you can definitely detect some faith getting lost. And Johnson, he's going to go forward, but, he's becoming more and more desperate. And, one thing I haven't mentioned is also, again, discussed in the book. All of this controversy over Marigold is at first secret in December 1966, but what some of you might remember is it coincides with a vast public controversy over the Hanoi bombings that rises when Harrison Salisbury of the New York Times goes to Hanoi and becomes the first American reporter to report from behind the lines and basically say, hey, I'm on the ground. And the Johnson administration is claiming that no bombs fell in the city of Hanoi and no civilian targets were hit. And I'm on the ground, and they're wrong. He backs up Hanoi's position. And so this becomes part of a incredibly gloomy winter for Lyndon Johnson on the war, and it's shared by many. Dean Rusk is still a true believer in some ways, but you can see at the highest level beginning to search for the exit door. If they can find it.
Thank you. Jim, congratulations on this remarkable accomplishment. Please join me in a round of applause, and thanks to all three commentators, all three speakers.